In the spring of 1917, male shock units and battalions of death were created from pools of enthusiastic volunteers to lead the way into battle. Already some women had successfully pensioned to join regular army units, and now a number began pressing the new provisional government to create special women's battalions. These women, along with a number of high-ranking members of the Russian government and military administration, believed that female soldiers would have a significant propaganda value. These women, along with a number of high-ranking members of the Russian government and the military administration, believed that female soldiers would have a significant propaganda value and that their example would revitalize the already demoralized men of the Russian army. Simultaneously, they hoped that the presence of women would shame the hesitant male soldiers into resuming their combat duties. 15 formations were created in 1917, including the 1st Women's Battalion of Death, a second unit called the 1st Petrograd's Women's Battalion, which is separate from the 1st unit. Later, the Petrograd would have another one, and then the 2nd Moscow Women's Battalion of Death created in Moscow, the 3rd Kuban's Women's Shock Battalion organized in Ekaterinburg. 4 communication detachments were created in Moscow and Petrograd. 7 additional communication units were created in Kiev and Stockholm, again employing privately organized women's units already existing in those cities. An all-female naval unit was created in Oranienbaum, the 1st Women's Naval Detachment, as part of the Naval Infantry Training Detachment. American reporter Bessie Beatty estimated the total number of women serving in these gender-segregated roles at about 5,000 at the fall of 1917, but only the 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death and the Prem Battalion actually saw combat on the front. Although some women who served in these units went along to fight on both sides of the Russian Civil War, the women's battalions never got to be part of the White Army, the Green Army, or the Black Army, or any other Russian political groups fighting the Bolsheviks. So let's talk about the battalions themselves. In 1917, Maria Bushkarova, a peasant woman who served in the Russian army since November 1914 and had risen to the ranks of a non-commissioned officer, pensioned the government to establish a battalion of female soldiers under her command. At the end of May, the Minister of War of the Russian Provisional Government, Alexander Kerensky, authorized the formation of the 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death in Petrograd. The 1st female combat unit initially attracted over 2,000 enlisteds between the ages of 18 and 40, but Bushkarova's strict discipline and the refusal to allow the formation of the Soldiers' Committee, or the Soviet, soon drove about all of them out except for about 300 volunteers left. Calling to action against the Germans during the Kerensky offensive, they were assigned to the 555 Korut Duskara Regiment and occupied the trenches near Smorgon. Ordered to go over the top, the soldiers of the warrior men's battalions hesitated. The women, however, decided to go on with or without them. Eventually, they pushed past 3 trenches into German territory, where soldiers discovered a stash of vodka, which the women tried to break before they could be drunk. In his report, the commander of the regiment praised the women's battalion's initiative and courage. However, relief units never arrived, and they were eventually forced to retreat, losing all the ground they have gained in the offensive. The 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death, commanded by Bushkarova, was still at the front after the revolution, but disbanded shortly after as a result of increasing hostilities from male troops. The creation of the 1st all-combat unit under Bushkarova inspired a number of other women in Russia to appeal to the government for inclusion in the armed forces. The Minister of War was flooded with letters and pensions from individuals and groups of women seeking to serve their nation at the front. In June, Kerensky approved the organization of an additional women's combat unit in Petrograd, the 1st Petrograd's Women's Battalion, with a complement of between 1,100 and 1,400 women and 2 communication detachments of 100 women each. Their training regiment included only parade drills, riflery, and night maneuvers, but also reading classes for the illiterate. On the 25th of October 1917, the battalion was called to the parade square for review before being sent to the front. After the parade, however, the battalion was instead ordered to defend the provisional government at the Winter Palace. The commander refused. Instead, the subdivision of the 2nd Company of 137 soldiers were dispatched to guard some nearby fuel trucks, but soon found themselves defending the palace alongside the units of the Cossacks and the cadets. They were overwhelmed by the numerically superior pro-Bolshevik forces and immediately and ultimately surrendered. Rumors of mass rape circulated the city after their capture, though interviews of these women found 3 cases of rape, but most of the instances of verbal abuse, physical violence, and threats of violence. The wife of the British ambassador to Russia requested that the British military attaché in Petrograd, General Alfred Knox, intervene to secure their rescue and release, which was accomplished on the 26th of October 1917. Those who were not disbanded or did not disband returned to the battalion's encampments outside the city and were rearmed. The 2nd Moscow's Women's Battalion of Death, as well as 2 separate communication detachments, were created in Moscow in June 1917. The battalion numbered at least 1,000 women by the end of the summer, and by the end of the fall, facing a lack of support from the government and the leadership of the battalion decided to disband, 500 women requested assignment to the front instead, and they were issued with transfers without the knowledge of the general staff. And by October the 25th, on the 25th of October 1917, and led by the founder Maria Bushkarova, the 2nd Women's Battalion of Death was the last army unit to defend the Winter Palace during the Russian Revolution. Authorization from the government for the formation of women's military units provided the impetus for private women's organizations to form their own quasi-unit military groups, which appeared in numerous cities around Russia. In an attempt to satisfy the popular demand and bring these units under its control, the Ministry of War expanded the number of women's military formations. The 4th Combat Battalion was formed in Ekodrina, the 3rd Kuban's Women's Shock Battalion created from the pre-existing grassroots unit. This battalion suffered from organizational and supply issues and actually never saw combat. These extensions failed to end the impromptu organization for quasi-military units of women's volunteers, and the government found it impossible to control such formations. Even the official women's units proved difficult. There was no consensus among the military administration as to the potential value of female soldiers, and this, coupled with the severe shortages from which every nation was suffering at the time, meant that the army only made a half-hearted commitment to the project. Thus, the women's unit received the inadequate attention and assistance from the military administration. Many among the Russian military authorities were waiting to see how the women fared in battle, and whether or not they had the positive effect on the male soldiers. Although the women performed well in combat and suffered few casualties, their example was not enough to inspire the mass war-weary soldiers to continue fighting. After the 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death failed to have the intended effect on revitalizing the war-weary elements of the Russian army, the military authorities began to question the value of women's units. In particular, the government found it very difficult to justify the allocation of badly needed resources to such unreliable projects. By August 1917, there was a great inclination in the military establishment to discontinue the organization of women for combat purposes. Facing withdrawal of official support, the 2nd Moscow Women's Battalion of Death began to disintegrate in September. Just prior to disbanding, however, about 500 volunteers were sent to the front on their own request, but without the knowledge or permission of the military authorities. Faced with the decision of what to do with these women units, the military at first decided to shift them to auxiliary roles away from the front, such as guarding railroads or fuel trucks. But this faced opposition from the men who were at these positions who did not want to be sent to the front. Instead, on the 30th of November 1917, the new Bolshevik government ordered for the official dissolution and disbandment of all female battalions of death. But Lenin later decided against some of his government wishes that they would have to stay and even expand, after combat reports showed that they actually did extremely well on the battlefield. The 1st Petrograd and the 3rd Kuban's Women's Battalions lingered in their camps until 1918, however. Some women who had served in these units actually went on to fight on both sides of the Russian Civil War. And that was the fate of the Women's Battalions of Death. I didn't